November 18th, 1945, Union Station, Toronto. The sound is the hiss of steam, the shriek of brakes, and the low murmur of 1,000 voices echoing under the vast arched ceiling. Platform 7 is crowded with officials, Red Cross volunteers, and curious onlookers pressed against the barriers. They are waiting for a train that is 6 hours late, delayed by early winter storms that have already blanketed southern Ontario in snow. When the train finally pulls in, belching black smoke into the cold air, a strange silence falls over the crowd, because the men stepping down onto the platform, clutching thin blankets around their shoulders and blinking in the harsh fluorescent lights, do not look like prisoners of war. They look like survivors of something far worse. These are Dutch prisoners, not captured soldiers, but civilian prisoners, survivors of Japanese labor camps in the Dutch East Indies. They were liberated by Allied forces months ago, but there was nowhere to send them. The Netherlands was still recovering from 5 years of occupation and the devastation of the hunger winter. Indonesia was in chaos, with independence movements and violence making return impossible. And so Canada, with its tradition of accepting refugees and displaced persons, agreed to take them. 240 men, most of them former colonial administrators, plantation managers, and engineers, who had spent 3.5 years starving, beaten, and worked nearly to death in the jungles of Java and Sumatra. Peter van der Berg steps off the train and feels the cold hit him like a physical blow. He is 31 years old. He weighs 110 pounds. 3 years ago, he weighed 180. He is wearing a donated British Army greatcoat that hangs on him like a tent, and his feet, wrapped in cloth because proper shoes do not yet fit his swollen ankles, are already going numb in the Canadian November cold. He looks around at the snow-covered platform, at the steam from the train mingling with the frozen breath of the waiting crowd, and he feels something close to despair. Because Peter van der Berg has survived the jungle. He has survived disease, starvation, and brutality that would break most men. But standing here in Toronto in November, feeling cold in a way he has never felt cold before, he is suddenly, terrifyingly certain of one thing. He will not survive the winter. The Dutch prisoners are not the only ones who think this. The Canadian officials responsible for them are worried too. These men are medically fragile, malnourished. Many have tropical diseases, malaria, dysentery, beriberi. Their bodies have been destroyed by years of privation, and now they are being asked to survive a Canadian winter, something that healthy men born in this climate sometimes struggle with. The Red Cross doctors give the Dutch prisoners medical examinations in the first week. The results are alarming. Most have vitamin deficiencies, so severe they can barely walk. Some have lost teeth from scurvy. Others have vision problems from starvation. And all of them, every single one, is terrified of the cold. Because to them, this November weather, which Canadians consider mild, feels like the end of the world. But this is not a story about men who froze to death in a foreign land. This is a story about something unexpected, something that none of the Dutch prisoners could have anticipated. This is the story of how ordinary Canadians, farmers and shopkeepers and housewives in small Ontario towns decided that these strange skeletal men from halfway around the world were not going to die on their watch. And how, in the process of saving them, both the Dutch prisoners and their Canadian hosts learned something about survival, about kindness, and about what it means to be human in the face of winter's indifference. The Canadian government's plan for the Dutch prisoners is straightforward and, in retrospect, woefully inadequate. The men will be housed temporarily in military barracks at Camp Borden, a training facility north of Toronto. They will receive medical care, food, and clothing, and they will wait there until arrangements can be made for their permanent resettlement, either back to the Netherlands or to other countries willing to accept them. It is a plan designed by bureaucrats in heated offices in Ottawa, people who have never starved, never been beaten, and who think of winter as an inconvenience rather than a mortal threat. The Dutch prisoners arrive at Camp Borden in late November. The barracks are wooden structures, uninsulated, heated by pot-bellied stoves that eat coal faster than the camp can supply it. Each building houses 40 men in 2-tiered bunks. There are thin wool blankets, 2 per man, and the same British Army greatcoats they arrived in. The camp commandant, a middle-aged major named Douglas McKinnon, who spent the war training recruits and never saw combat, looks at the Dutch prisoners with poorly concealed concern. He has been told these men are recovered prisoners of war. He was not told they look like walking corpses. Major McKinnon calls a meeting with his staff on the second day. "These men are not going to make it through the winter in these conditions," he says bluntly. "Look at them. They can barely stand. Half of them are sick, and it's not even December yet. His quartermaster, a practical man from Winnipeg named Ed Grayson, nods. We need more blankets, more coats, better food, and we need it now, not next month when the requisitions come through. But the military supply system is slow. The war is over. Resources are being demobilized. Priority goes to returning Canadian soldiers, not to foreign prisoners who are technically not Canada's responsibility. The requests for additional supplies are filed, and the winter continues to close in. By early December, the temperature at Camp Borden drops to -10 degrees Celsius. To the Dutch prisoners, this is an alien, incomprehensible cold. They have spent years in the tropics where the temperature never drops below 20 degrees. They have no frame of reference for this. The cold penetrates everything. It seeps through the walls of the barracks. It turns the thin blankets into useless cloth. It makes breathing painful, and it makes the Dutch prisoners, already weakened, begin to sicken in new ways. Peter Vanderberg wakes up one morning in early December and cannot feel his feet, not because they are numb from cold, though they are, but because he has no sensation in them at all. A camp doctor examines him and diagnoses early-stage frostbite and peripheral neuropathy, likely caused by years of malnutrition combined with exposure to cold. The doctor is frank. If we don't get you warmer, you're going to lose your toes, maybe your feet. Peter asks how to get warmer. The doctor has no answer. The stoves in the barracks are running full blast. They have used their weekly coal ration in 3 days. There is no more. The men huddle together for warmth, sharing blankets, sleeping in their coats and boots, but it is not enough. And then, on December 8th, something happens that changes everything. A farmer from the nearby town of Angus, a man named William Corbett, shows up at the camp gate with a truck full of firewood. He has heard through some small-town gossip network that there are foreign prisoners at the camp who are freezing because the military cannot keep them supplied with coal. William Corbett is 52 years old. He farms 200 acres of mixed crops and dairy cattle. He has no connection to the Dutch, no reason to care about men from a country he could not find on a map. But he has spent his entire life in rural Ontario, and he knows one thing with absolute certainty. You do not let people freeze to death. Not if you can help it. He pulls up to the camp gate and tells the guard he has a delivery. The guard, confused, calls Major McKinnon. McKinnon comes to the gate, looks at the truck loaded with split hardwood, and asks what this is about. Heard you boys were running short on fuel, Corbett says simply. Figured I could help. McKinnon, a man not given to emotion, feels his throat tighten. We can't pay you. Not right away. The requisition process, Corbett waves him off. Don't want payment. Just get that wood to whoever needs it. He unloads the truck himself, stacking the wood near one of the barracks. Then, he drives away before McKinnon can properly thank him. That night, the Dutch prisoners in Barrack 7 burn William Corbett's firewood. The stove roars. The barrack warms. For the first time since arriving in Canada, the men sleep without shivering. And Peter Vanderberg, lying on his bunk with his feet finally starting to tingle with returning sensation, thinks about the strange farmer who brought them wood and asked for nothing in return. It is an act of kindness, so simple and yet so profound, that Peter, who has spent 3 years learning to trust no one, does not quite know how to process it. But this is not the end of the story. It is the beginning. Because word spreads. In Angus, in nearby Barrie, in the small farming communities that dot the countryside around Camp Borden, people hear about the Dutch prisoners, and they start showing up. Not with fanfare, not organized by any official body, just individuals and families who decide that something needs to be done. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a widow from Barrie whose son died in the liberation of the Netherlands, knits 12 heavy wool sweaters and delivers them to the camp. She does not leave her name. The Red Cross volunteer who receives them finds a note pinned to one that says simply, "For the Dutch, from a grateful Canadian." A church group from Angus organizes a collection. They gather blankets, coats, scarves, mittens, and wool socks. The minister, Reverend Thomas MacLeod, brings them to the camp in his own car, making 3 trips because he cannot fit everything in one load. When Major McKinnon asks why the church is doing this, MacLeod looks at him as if the question is absurd. Because they're cold, he says, and we're not. The Ladies' Auxiliary of the Royal Canadian Legion in Barrie hears about the Dutch prisoners and decides to help. These are women who have spent the war years knitting socks for soldiers, rolling bandages, and organizing fundraisers. The war may be over, but their sense of duty is not. They begin knitting in earnest, wool socks, heavy sweaters, toques, scarves. Every week they deliver bags of hand-knitted items to the camp, and every week more women join the effort. By mid-December, half the women in Barry seem to be knitting for the Dutch prisoners. The items arrive with notes. Stay warm. Welcome to Canada. You are not forgotten. The Dutch prisoners, most of whom speak limited English, cannot fully read these notes, but they understand the sentiment. And slowly, hesitantly, they begin to believe that maybe, just maybe, they are not going to die here. But the most significant help comes not from organizations, but from individual families who do something extraordinary. They open their homes. The idea starts with a doctor from Barry named James Rutherford. Dr. Rutherford has been volunteering at Camp Borden, helping treat the Dutch prisoners. He is appalled by their condition and frustrated by the military's inability to provide adequate care. One evening in mid-December, he is having dinner with his wife Margaret when he says something that will change dozens of lives. "We have a spare bedroom," he says. "We should bring one of them home." Margaret looks at her husband. They have 3 children. They are not wealthy. Their home is comfortable but not large. But she has met some of the Dutch prisoners when she accompanied her husband to the camp. She has seen their hollow eyes and skeletal frames. And she knows her husband is right. "Which one?" she asks. Dr. Rutherford chooses Peter van der Berg, not because Peter is the sickest, though he is close, but because Peter speaks some English, learned during his years managing a rubber plantation before the war, and because Dr. Rutherford believes Peter has the will to survive if given a real chance. When Dr. Rutherford approaches Major McKinnon with the idea, the major is initially hesitant. There are regulations, procedures. The Dutch prisoners are technically wards of the Canadian government, but McKinnon is also pragmatic. He can see that the camp is not equipped to handle these men through a Canadian winter. If some can be housed privately, under medical supervision, it might save lives. He approves a trial program. Dutch prisoners who are medically stable enough can be placed with volunteer Canadian families for the winter months. The families will provide room and board. The government will provide a small stipend to cover costs. Dr. Rutherford becomes the first to participate. On December 20th, Peter van der Berg leaves Camp Borden and moves into the Rutherford home in Barry. He arrives carrying everything he owns in a small canvas bag, a donated bag because he owned nothing when he left the labor camp. He stands in the Rutherford's front hallway, overwhelmed by the warmth from the wood stove, by the smell of cooking food, by the sound of children's laughter from upstairs. Margaret Rutherford shows him to the spare bedroom. It has a real bed with a thick mattress, clean white sheets, a heavy quilt, a window with curtains. Peter sits on the edge of the bed and cries, not from sadness, from the sheer shock of being warm and safe. That first night, the Rutherfords learn the depth of Peter's trauma. At dinner, Margaret serves roast chicken with potatoes and vegetables. Peter stares at the plate, his hands shaking. "I cannot," he says quietly. "It is too much." Dr. Rutherford understands immediately. Peter's stomach has shrunk from years of near starvation. A normal meal will make him sick. They start with smaller portions, soup, bread, slowly increasing over days and weeks, and Peter begins to heal. Not just physically, though his weight gradually increases, but psychologically. He is no longer in survival mode. He can sleep without fear. He can eat without hoarding food. He can begin to imagine a future. But Peter's integration into the Rutherford household is not without challenges. The cultural differences are vast. Peter is formal, reserved, shaped by colonial Dutch society and traumatized by years of imprisonment. The Rutherfords are warm, informal, a typical Canadian family. There are misunderstandings, language barriers, moments of awkwardness, but there is also something that transcends all of this. There is kindness. Margaret Rutherford treats Peter not as a charity case but as a guest. She asks about his life before the war. She learns about his wife and daughter, last seen when he was arrested by the Japanese in 1942. She learns that he does not know if they survived. She sees the pain in his eyes when he talks about them, and she makes sure he knows that he is welcome in her home for as long as he needs. The Rutherford children, initially shy around the strange thin man with the haunted eyes, gradually warm to him. Peter, who has not seen his own daughter in 3 years, finds himself telling them stories, not about the war, not about the camps, but about Indonesia, about elephants and tigers, about rubber plantations and tropical storms. The children are fascinated, and Peter, in telling these stories, reconnects with a part of himself he thought was lost. By January, other families in the area hear about the Rutherfords' Dutch guest, and they start volunteering. William Corbett, the farmer who brought the first load of firewood, takes in 2 Dutch prisoners. They are brothers, Hendrik and Jan Mulder, who spent the war in separate camps and only found each other again in Canada. Corbett puts them to work on his farm. Not hard labor, they are far too weak for that, but simple tasks, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, mending fences, work that gives them purpose and structure. The Mulders, who've spent 3 years as slaves in Japanese labor camps, are initially suspicious. Why is this Canadian farmer helping them? What does he want? But Corbett wants nothing except their company and perhaps a little help around the farm when they are strong enough to give it. He teaches them about Canadian agriculture, about winter wheat and ice fishing and how to keep pipes from freezing. And in return, they teach him about Indonesia, about the life they lost and hope someday to return to. A schoolteacher in Angus named Dorothy Fletcher takes in a Dutch prisoner named Karel van Oosten, a former schoolteacher himself. Karel is suffering from severe depression, a common condition among the survivors. He barely speaks. He sits for hours staring at nothing. But Dorothy, who has spent 20 years teaching children, has infinite patience. She does not force conversation. She simply includes Karel in her daily routine. He sits in the kitchen while she prepares meals. He sits in the living room while she grades papers. And slowly, over weeks, he begins to engage. He asks about her students. He offers to help with grading. He starts speaking again. Not about the camps, not yet, but about teaching, about books, about the life he once had. By February, there are over 30 Dutch prisoners living with Canadian families in the Barrie and Angus area. And the transformation is remarkable. The men who leave Camp Borden are pale, sickly, withdrawn. The men who return for weekly medical checkups are gaining weight, regaining color, beginning to smile. The experiment is working, but it is not without complications. The complications come not from the Dutch prisoners, but from the winter itself. Because while the Canadian families are kind and generous, they cannot change the weather. And the winter of 1945 to 46 is brutal. By January, temperatures plunge to -25°C. Snow falls in heavy, relentless storms. Roads become impassable. Farms are cut off for days at a time. And the Dutch prisoners, even those living in warm homes, struggle with the sheer alienness of a Canadian winter. Peter van der Berg, living with the Rutherfords, experiences his first true blizzard in mid-January. He wakes up one morning to find the world has disappeared. Everything outside is white, the wind is howling like a living thing. Snow is piling against the windows. He comes downstairs to find Dr. Rutherford calmly drinking coffee. "Big storm," Rutherford says casually. "We'll be stuck inside for a day or two." Peter looks out the window at the blinding white chaos. "This is normal?" he asks, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. Rutherford laughs, not unkindly. This is just a snowstorm. Wait until we get a real blizzard." For Peter, who has spent his entire adult life in the tropics, the concept of being trapped inside by weather is incomprehensible and terrifying. In the jungle camps, you could always move, always escape if you had the chance. But here, nature itself is a prison. He spends the day pacing, checking the windows, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible is happening. Margaret Rutherford recognizes his distress. She does not mock it or tell him to calm down. Instead, she does something simple and profound. She teaches him about winter. She shows him how to read the weather, how to tell the difference between a light snow and a serious storm, how to prepare, how to stay safe. She teaches him that winter is not an enemy to be feared, but a season to be respected and managed. And slowly, Peter begins to understand that the Canadians are not indifferent to the cold. They have simply learned to live with it. Over at William Corbett's farm, the Mulder brothers are learning similar lessons. Corbett teaches them how to dress for the cold. Layers, he explains. Not one heavy coat, but multiple layers that trap air and insulate. He teaches them about wind chill, about frostbite, about the importance of keeping extremities covered. And he teaches them practical skills, how to start a fire in the snow, how to break ice on the water trough for the cattle, how to walk on ice without falling. These lessons are delivered casually in the course of daily farm work, but they are life-saving knowledge. The Mulders, who arrived in Canada certain they would freeze to death, begin to realize that survival is possible. Difficult, but possible. But the education goes both ways. The Canadian families learn from their Dutch guests. They learn about resilience, about what humans can endure, about the strength required to survive 3 years of hell and still remain human. Peter tells Dr. Rutherford late one night over cups of tea about the labor camps. He does not go into graphic detail, but he speaks of hunger that gnaws at you every waking moment, of disease that kills men in days, of brutality that is casual, random, designed to break the spirit as much as the body. And he speaks of the small acts of kindness that kept men alive. A stolen potato shared among 5 men, a malaria patient carried to the latrine by his friends, the whispered reminder in the darkest moments that the war would not last forever. Dr. Rutherford listens, and he understands something important. The kindness his family is showing Peter is not new to Peter. It is a continuation of something that started in the camps. The difference is that here, in Canada, the kindness comes with safety, and that makes all the difference. By February, the Dutch prisoners are beginning to integrate into the community in unexpected ways. Karel van Oosten, the schoolteacher living with Dorothy Fletcher, volunteers to give a talk at the local high school about Indonesia. He speaks to a classroom of teenagers about Dutch colonial life, about the Japanese invasion, about what he has lost. The students are mesmerized. Many have never met anyone from outside North America. Some have relatives who fought in Europe, but the Pacific War feels distant, almost fictional. Karel makes it real. And in doing so, he begins to reconnect with his identity as a teacher, as someone who has something valuable to share. The Mulder brothers, working on Corbett's farm, begin attending the local church. They are Catholic, and the church in Angus is Protestant, but the minister welcomes them warmly. The congregation, many of whom have been donating clothing and supplies to the Dutch prisoners, are curious about these men they have been helping from a distance. The Mulders, initially uncomfortable being the center of attention, gradually open up. They speak in halting English about their gratitude, about their amazement at Canadian kindness, about their hope to someday return to Indonesia and rebuild their lives. These interactions do something unexpected. They change the Canadian community as well. The people of Barrie and Angus have lived through the Depression and the war years. They have sent their sons overseas. They have rationed and sacrificed. But most of them have never directly seen the cost of the war. The Dutch prisoners make it visible. The skeletal frames, the missing teeth, the nightmares that wake them, screaming in the night. The locals realize that the war they read about in newspapers had real victims, real human costs, and this realization deepens their commitment to helping. By March, as winter slowly begins to release its grip, something remarkable has happened. The Dutch prisoners are no longer just surviving, they are beginning to live. Peter van der Berg has gained 30 pounds, his color has returned, his feet, once swollen and numb, have healed. He goes for walks with the Rutherford children, teaching them Dutch phrases, laughing when they mangle the pronunciation. He helps Margaret in the kitchen, learning to cook Canadian dishes that once seemed impossibly rich. He sits with Dr. Rutherford in the evenings, discussing philosophy, history, the future. He has begun to hope again. But the story takes another turn in April when spring finally arrives, and with it, news from overseas. The Red Cross has been searching for the families of the Dutch prisoners, trying to locate wives, children, relatives who might have survived the war. For months there has been nothing. The chaos in Indonesia, the collapse of colonial administration, the violence of the independence movement, all have made communication nearly impossible. But in April, letters begin to arrive. Some carry good news. Families have been found. Wives and children are alive, waiting in refugee camps in Singapore or Australia. But many letters carry bad news. Families that did not survive. Children who died in camps. Wives who succumbed to disease or violence. Peter van der Berg receives his letter on April 12th. He opens it with shaking hands, Dr. Rutherford sitting beside him for support. The letter is from the International Red Cross office in Singapore. It is 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph confirms that Peter's wife, Anna, survived the war. She was interned in a civilian camp on Java. She is alive. Peter stops reading. His vision blurs. Anna is alive. The woman he has thought about every day for 3 years, the face that kept him going through the darkest times, is alive. But then he reads the second paragraph. His daughter, Sophie, died in the camp. Dysentery. She was 7 years old. The third paragraph provides logistical information. Anna is currently in a displaced persons camp in Singapore. Arrangements are being made for her repatriation. Peter sits in silence for a long time. Dr. Rutherford does not speak. There's nothing to say. Finally, Peter stands. "I need to walk," he says. He goes outside into the April cold, which no longer terrifies him, and he walks through the streets of Barrie for hours. He walks past the houses where families are eating dinner, where children are playing, where life continues in its ordinary way. And he thinks about his daughter, who will never walk these streets, never see snow, never grow up. He thinks about his wife, alone in a camp halfway around the world, carrying the same grief. And he thinks about the Canadians who saved his life, who kept him alive long enough to receive this news, this terrible, wonderful news. When he returns to the Rutherford home that night, Margaret is waiting. She has heard. She does not offer platitudes. She simply hugs him, and Peter, who has not allowed himself to be vulnerable since the camps, breaks down. He sobs in the arms of this Canadian woman who owes him nothing and has given him everything. And Margaret holds him and lets him grieve. Over the next weeks, similar scenes play out across the region. Letters arrive. Some Dutch prisoners learn their families are safe. Others learn they have lost everyone. The joy and the grief are sometimes separated by minutes, by houses, by the thin walls of the barracks at Camp Borden, where some prisoners still live. The Canadian families who have taken in Dutch prisoners become not just hosts, but counselors, therapists, surrogate family members. They help the men process the news. They help them plan for the future. They help them mourn. And they continue to provide the simple, powerful gift of presence. You are not alone. By May, as the weather warms and the snow melts, the Canadian government begins making arrangements for the Dutch prisoners to leave. Some will return to the Netherlands, which is slowly rebuilding. Some will go to Indonesia if the political situation stabilizes. Some will emigrate to Australia or South Africa. A few will ask to stay in Canada permanently. Peter Vanderberg is one of those who asks to stay. His wife Anna is being brought to Canada to join him. They have nothing to return to in Indonesia. Their daughter is gone. The plantation where Peter worked is destroyed. The colonial system that employed them has collapsed. Canada, the country that saved Peter's life, the country where he learned to survive winter and found kindness in the darkest time, feels like home. Dr. Rutherford helps Peter with the immigration paperwork. The process is complex, but the Canadian government is sympathetic to Dutch refugees who wish to settle. By July, Peter's application is approved. He will become a landed immigrant with the possibility of citizenship after 5 years. In August, Anna arrives in Canada. She has not seen her husband in 3 years. They meet at Union Station in Toronto, the same place where Peter first arrived in Canada 9 months earlier. Peter, who now weighs 160 pounds and wears a proper suit purchased with money earned from translating work, barely recognizes the woman stepping off the train. Anna is thin, gray-haired, aged by grief. But when their eyes meet, something passes between them. Recognition, relief, shared pain. They embrace on the platform, and around them, Red Cross volunteers and curious onlookers quietly look away, giving them privacy in this public moment. Peter brings Anna to Barrie, to the Rutherford home where he has been living. Margaret Rutherford welcomes Anna as warmly as she welcomed Peter. She helps Anna settle in, gives her space to grieve, helps her navigate this strange new country. And slowly, over weeks and months, Peter and Anna begin to rebuild. Not the life they had. That life is gone forever. But a new life, here in Canada, where they are safe. They find a small apartment in Barrie. Peter gets a job as a clerk at a lumber mill, using his English and his education. Anna begins working as a seamstress. They attend the local Dutch Reformed church, finding community with other Dutch immigrants. They slowly, carefully begin to heal. By the winter of 1946 to 47, most of the Dutch prisoners have left Camp Borden. Some have returned overseas, others have settled in Canada. But the connections formed during that first terrible winter remain. Peter and Anna Vanderberg spend Christmas with the Rutherford family. It is their first Christmas in Canada, their first Christmas without their daughter. It is painful, but it is also healing. Because the Rutherfords do not try to replace Sophie. They simply include Peter and Anna in their family traditions, making space for grief while also celebrating life. The Mulder brothers, Hendrik and Jan, have both decided to stay in Canada. They are still working for William Corbett, who has offered them permanent positions on his farm. They are saving money to eventually buy their own land. They have learned to love Canadian winters, the way the snow transforms the landscape, the quietness of a winter morning. Karel van Oosten has returned to teaching. He is working as a substitute teacher in the Angus school system, teaching history and geography. He shares an apartment with 2 other Dutch refugees. He is not remarried. His wife died in the camps. But he has found purpose again. He's alive in a way he was not when he first arrived. And Dorothy Fletcher, the school teacher who took him in, remains a close friend, someone he visits for Sunday dinner, someone who reminds him that kindness exists. These stories play out across southern Ontario wherever Dutch prisoners were placed. Not all have happy endings. Some men, too broken by what they experienced, struggle to adapt. Some marriages do not survive the reunion. Some refugees, unable to settle in the cold Canadian climate, eventually move to warmer places. But the majority, against all odds, survive. They survive the Canadian winter that they were sure would kill them. They survive the trauma that follows them from the camps. They survive the grief of what they lost. And they build new lives in a country that, despite its harsh climate, showed them warmth. The Canadian families who helped them are changed too. The Rutherfords, the Corbetts, the Fletchers, and dozens of others discover that helping others is not a burden, but a gift. They see the strength of the human spirit. They see what people can overcome. They see that kindness matters. And they carry these lessons forward into their own lives. Years later, when historians examine the post-war period in Canada, they focus on big topics: the returning veterans, the baby boom, economic expansion. But in the small towns around Camp Borden, people remember something else. They remember the winter of 1945 to 46, when Dutch prisoners came to Canada expecting to die, and instead found life. Peter van der Berg lives in Barrie for the rest of his life. He and Anna never have more children. Anna is unable to after years of malnutrition and illness in the camps. But they build a good life. Peter eventually gets a job as a warehouse manager. Anna becomes known for her baking, particularly her Dutch pastries that she sells at the local market. They become Canadian citizens in 1950. They buy a small house. They make friends. And every Christmas, they have dinner with the Rutherfords, a tradition that lasts until Dr. Rutherford's death in 1972. When Peter himself dies in 1984, at the age of 70, his funeral is attended by dozens of people. Former Dutch prisoners who settled in the area, members of the Dutch-Canadian community, and Canadians who remember that first winter when their town opened its homes to strangers. Margaret Rutherford, now elderly herself, speaks at the funeral. She talks about the thin, frightened man who came to her home in December 1945. She talks about how he taught her children about the wider world. She talks about how his presence in her home enriched her family's life. And she says something that captures the entire story. "We thought we were saving Peter," she says, "but in many ways he saved us too. He reminded us what really matters, not comfort, not convenience, but connection, compassion, the willingness to see another person suffering and do something about it." The story of the Dutch prisoners and the Canadian winter is not a famous story. It does not appear in history textbooks. There are no monuments or plaques commemorating what happened. But in the memories of those who lived it, in the descendants of both the Dutch prisoners and the Canadian families who helped them, the story lives on. It is a story about survival, about the human capacity to adapt to even the harshest environments when given support and kindness. It is a story about strangers becoming family, about communities coming together without being asked, without expecting recognition, simply because it was the right thing to do. And it is a story about winter. Not winter as an enemy, but winter as a teacher. The Dutch prisoners learned that winter could be survived. That cold was not death if you had warmth to return to. That darkness was temporary if you had light to guide you. And the Canadians learned that their winter, which they took for granted, could be a terror to those unprepared for it. But they also learned that winter's harshness made their kindness more powerful. A blanket means little in summer. But in January, in a barrack where men are freezing, a blanket is everything. The lesson that both groups learned, though neither would have articulated it this way, is that survival is not just an individual act. It is communal. You survive not alone, but together. The Dutch prisoners survived because Canadians helped them, and the Canadians, living through the difficult post-war years, found meaning and purpose in helping. Neither group would have been the same without the other. In the end, this is what the story is about. Not about the cold, though the cold was real and deadly. Not about trauma, though the trauma was profound, but about the human response to suffering, about ordinary people who saw other people in need and said simply, "We can help." No grand gestures, no heroic declarations, just wood delivered in a truck, sweaters knitted by church ladies, a spare bedroom offered to a stranger, patience with someone learning to live again. These small acts, multiplied across dozens of families and hundreds of interactions, saved lives. They turned a story that could have been about death and despair into a story about life and hope. And they showed that even in the depths of winter, warmth can be found, not just in heated homes and wool blankets, though those matter, but in the warmth of human connection, in the recognition that we are all, in the end, just people trying to survive, and that we survive best when we help each other. That is what the Dutch prisoners learned in Canada. And that is what they carried with them, whether they stayed in Canada or eventually left for the rest of their lives. Winter would come again, many times, but they had learned how to survive it, not alone, but together, and that made all the difference.